Late fall 1883. Northern Montana was running out of time. When winter came here, it didn't arrive gently. It came hard, fast, and without apology. Men on the frontier understood this. That's why every autumn the sound of axes filled the valleys. Trees came down, logs were stacked, cabins went up as quickly as human hands could manage. Wood meant survival, or at least that's what everyone believed. So when one newcomer ignored the timber and walked straight toward the limestone hillside, people noticed. When he lifted a pickaxe instead of a saw, they stopped working to watch. And when he began cutting into solid rock, the watching turned into laughter. From their point of view, it made sense. Rock was cold. Rock was damp. Rock was where animals hid, not where men lived. Out here, you didn't experiment with shelter. You followed what worked. And what had always worked was wood fire and a roof you could repair fast when the wind tore at it. But this man didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't ask for approval. He just kept digging. Each strike sent a dull echo through the valley. Chips of limestone piled at his feet. While others raced the calendar, he worked slowly, carefully, shaping an opening into the hillside, not straight in, slightly upward, deliberate. Neighbors called it foolish, some called it dangerous. A few said he was digging his own grave. They didn't understand what he understood. Winter on the frontier wasn't just about staying warm. It was about staying warm without burning through everything you owned. Firewood took time. Time meant labor. Labor meant exhaustion. And exhaustion got people killed. Cabins lost heat constantly. Fires had to be fed all night. Miss one feeding and the cold crept in fast. Children coughed. Water froze. Fingers went numb before sunrise. This man had watched that cycle before. He knew it well enough to reject it. Instead of fighting the cold with endless fire, he chose to step out of the fight entirely. He trusted the one thing winter couldn't overpower, the earth itself. And while the frontier laughed, he carved a shelter that wasn't trying to beat winter at its own game, but to avoid the game altogether. This wasn't a stunt, and it wasn't luck. The man digging into that hillside wasn't guessing. He was working from experience most frontier builders didn't have. Before he ever set foot in Montana, he had spent years underground in stone quarries back in Europe. Not shallow pits, but deep cuts into limestone and bedrock. Places where daylight disappeared and seasons stopped mattering. Down there, winter never followed you. Men worked in steady temperatures while snow piled up above their heads. Frost cracked the surface, rivers froze, but deep inside the rock the air stayed calm and predictable. You could feel it on your skin. You could measure it with a thermometer. The numbers barely moved. That stayed with him. Most builders judged shelter by how fast it could be built. He judged it by how it behaved in February. Wood reacted instantly to cold. Stone did not. Stone changed slowly. It absorbed heat slowly. It released heat slowly. Once it warmed, it stayed warm. Once it cooled, it resisted further loss. That wasn't theory. He'd lived it shift after shift, winter after winter. When he arrived in the American West and saw limestone cliffs rising along the valley, he recognized something others overlooked. They saw unusable land, too rocky to farm, too steep for livestock, too hard to build on. He saw insulation that didn't rot, walls that didn't burn, a foundation that had already survived 1,000 winters. More importantly, he understood something simple but critical. Underground temperature didn't follow air temperature. It followed earth temperature, and earth temperature stayed steady year-round once you went deep enough. That meant he wasn't trying to heat a frozen space from zero every night. He was starting from a stable baseline and adding just enough warmth to make it comfortable. That difference mattered. It meant less firewood, less work, less risk. While others planned for how much wood they would need to cut just to survive, he planned how little he could get away with. That's why he angled the tunnel upward. That's why he carved deeper instead of wider. That's why he paid attention to airflow before furniture. He wasn't building a cabin. He was building a system, and systems, when built right, don't need constant attention. They work quietly in the background while life goes on. That kind of thinking didn't look impressive on the surface. It didn't photograph well. It didn't satisfy tradition. But when winter arrived, tradition wasn't the one sleeping warm. The earth was. On the frontier, log cabins weren't bad design. They were the best option people knew. Logs were available. Tools were simple. A small group of men could raise walls in days instead of weeks. When survival depended on speed, that mattered. But speed came at a cost most settlers accepted without question. Wood doesn't store heat, it loses it. Every log cabin followed the same pattern: fire in one end, smoke out the top, heat rising, leaking through the roof, slipping through gaps in the walls. Chinking helped, but it never sealed everything. Wind always found a way in, cold always found a way through. The fire became the center of life, not by choice, but by necessity. If the fire died, the cabin cooled fast. Bedrooms turned frigid. Water buckets skinned over with ice by morning. Parents woke every few hours to feed the stove, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. A typical cabin burned 4 to 6 cords of wood each winter. That meant weeks of cutting, splitting, stacking, and hauling. It meant injury risk. It meant time taken away from food repairs and rest. And even after all that, most cabins stayed cold. 50 degrees near the hearth was considered good. Bedrooms often sat 10 or 15 degrees lower. Children slept bundled tight, breath visible in the dark. Older settlers felt the cold in their bones long after the fire was stoked. The problem wasn't craftsmanship. Many of these cabins were well built by skilled hands. The problem was physics. Heat moves toward cold. Light materials lose heat quickly. Air rises and escapes. Log cabins fought these realities instead of working with them. The man in the hillside saw this clearly. He wasn't criticizing the builders. He understood why they did what they did. He also knew they were paying a hidden price every winter, 1 cord of wood at a time. Where cabins demanded constant attention, he wanted stability. Where cabins fluctuated wildly between warm and cold, he wanted consistency. That's why he rejected walls made of air-filled gaps and chose walls made of mass. Not because wood was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Winter on the frontier didn't reward effort alone. It rewarded efficiency. And log cabins, for all their familiarity, were quietly failing the people inside them, not dramatically, not suddenly, but night after night, season after season. The cold didn't kill quickly. It just wore people down. He intended to stop that. From the outside, the shelter looked wrong. There were no walls rising into the sky, no squared corners, no roofline. Just a dark opening cut into the limestone hillside, low and narrow, almost easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. People assumed it was unfinished. It wasn't. Every detail was intentional. The entrance didn't go straight in. It dipped slightly, then rose again before opening into the living space. Most men would have flattened the floor for convenience. He didn't. That shallow dip mattered. Cold air is heavier than warm air. It sinks. By lowering the tunnel floor and raising the threshold into the main chamber, he created a natural cold trap. Frigid air settled in the entrance and stayed there. Warm air stayed where it belonged. No door required, no moving parts, no maintenance. Just gravity doing its job. He carved the tunnel long enough to slow wind, but short enough to move supplies easily. He angled it upward just enough to prevent water from pooling during snowmelt. He followed the natural grain of the limestone, not fighting it, so the rock held its own weight. The ceiling inside wasn't flat. It curved gently upward into an arch, not for beauty, for strength. An arch distributes pressure naturally. The rock above supported itself without timber beams that could rot or crack. He left pillars where the stone demanded it, removed material only where it was safe. This wasn't brute force excavation. It was careful subtraction. Ventilation came next. Most people assumed a cave would suffocate its occupant. He knew better. He carved narrow air shafts that allowed fresh air to enter without stripping heat. Cool air moved in low. Warm air drifted out high, slow, controlled. No drafts, no smoke buildup. This wasn't guesswork. It was the same approach used in old mines and underground workshops where men had survived long shifts without freezing or choking. From the outside, neighbors saw a hole in the hill. From the inside, it was already becoming something else. A stable environment, a space that didn't react violently to every weather change. A shelter that worked quietly instead of demanding attention. Frontier logic said speed mattered most. He believed endurance mattered more. While others hurried to finish cabins before snowfall, he took his time shaping a shelter that wouldn't care when the snow came or how long it stayed. They called it stubbornness. It wasn't. It was preparation. Duavau outline Jarviet. What confused people most wasn't the shelter itself. It was how he planned to heat it. There was no large hearth, no open fireplace roaring day and night, no stack of logs waiting beside the door. Instead, he carved a small firebox directly into the limestone wall. Narrow, compact, almost unimpressive. Neighbors assumed it was a mistake. A small fire meant a cold shelter. That was frontier logic. Bigger fires meant more heat. Anything else was gambling with frostbite. But he wasn't trying to heat air. He was heating stone. Above the firebox, the chimney didn't rise straight up. It twisted and traveled through the rock for many feet before reaching the surface. Every inch of that path mattered. As smoke moved through the stone, heat bled out of it, not into the room, into the walls themselves. The rock absorbed it slowly, steadily. That was the entire idea. In a log cabin, heat enters the room fast and leaves just as fast. The moment the fire dies, the temperature drops. In this shelter, the fire acted like a charger, not the engine. The limestone became the engine. Once warmed, the stone didn't cool quickly. It released heat back into the space over hours, even half a day later. The room stayed comfortable without constant feeding. He didn't burn wood for brightness or show. He burned it for storage. 6 pieces of split pine could raise the temperature noticeably. Another small firing later in the day kept it there. When the fire went out, the shelter didn't notice. That's what unsettled people when they stepped inside. The warmth didn't feel sharp or smoky. It felt even, gentle, like standing near sun-warmed rock long after sunset. They expected cold walls. Instead, they touched limestone that held warmth like a memory. The shelter wasn't fighting winter. It was buffering it. That difference mattered more than anything else. It meant fewer trees cut, fewer hours spent hauling wood, less risk of fire, less fatigue. Most frontier homes demanded constant attention to survive winter. This one demanded understanding. Fire wasn't the hero here. Stone was, and stone didn't burn out overnight. January didn't test ideas, it tested results. The cold arrived the way it always did on the northern frontier, sudden and absolute. One night the air still moved. The next, it felt brittle. Timber popped in the dark. Rivers slowed, then locked. Livestock stopped wandering and stood with their backs to the wind. By morning, the temperature sat far below zero. In cabins across the valley, fires were already burning hard before dawn. Men fed them without measuring. Women wrapped children in extra layers. No one expected comfort. The goal was to keep the cold from winning outright. That's how winter worked out here. Inside the hillside, there was no rush. The stone had been warming for weeks. Not quickly, not dramatically. Slowly, the way it always did. Each small fire added a little more heat to the mass around the room. When the outside temperature collapsed, the shelter barely reacted. That was the point. Cold doesn't move through rock the way it moves through air. It creeps. It takes time. By the time winter reached the outer layers of limestone, The inner stone was already warm and resisting the loss. The firebox held only coals that morning. No flames, no panic. The room stayed steady. Meanwhile, cabins fought wild swings. 50 degrees near the fire. 38 by morning. Floors freezing. Walls sweating with frost. Families burned through wood faster than they could replace it. Every log fed into the stove bought an hour. Miss a feeding and the temperature dropped fast. Sleep came in short pieces. The man in the hillside slept through the night, not because the fire burned longer, but because it didn't need to. The stone carried the work. Heat moved from wall to air, not the other way around. Even when the fire went dark, the room stayed warm enough to forget the weather entirely. That's when doubt started to creep in. People noticed smoke rising less often from the hillside than from the cabins. They noticed the woodpile wasn't shrinking the same way. They noticed the man wasn't hauling logs in the dark or chopping ice from his water. No one said anything yet. Winter wasn't finished, and the frontier trusted only what lasted. But the first hard freeze had passed and the shelter hadn't flinched. The earth had done exactly what he expected it to do. It stayed steady. The real test came before sunrise. On one of the coldest mornings of the season, a neighbor rode out to the hillside. Part concern, part curiosity. The temperature sat deep below zero. Breath froze in the air. Leather creaked. Even the horse resisted stopping. From a distance, something looked wrong. There was no heavy smoke pouring from the shelter, no frantic sign of a fire being pushed to its limit, just a thin, steady plume drifting upward, slow and calm. That didn't make sense. Smoke meant heat. Heat meant fire. And in weather like this, fire should have been roaring. The rider dismounted and stepped toward the entrance. As he reached the tunnel, he felt it. Not heat exactly, but the absence of pain. The sharp bite of cold softened. The air changed. By the time he reached the main chamber, he was unbuttoning his coat. Inside, the man from the hillside stood in simple indoor clothes. No gloves, no heavy layers, no sign of strain. The firebox held only glowing coals. A thermometer hung on the wall. The number stopped the visitor cold. It was warmer inside that shelter than most cabins ever managed, even with fires burning full tilt. And it had been that way all night. The visitor did the math without saying it out loud. Outside temperature versus inside temperature. Wood burned versus warmth gained. The numbers didn't line up with what he believed. That's when the questions started. How much wood did you burn? When did you last feed the fire? How deep is the rock around this room? The answers were short, measured, unemotional. Very little, hours ago. Deep enough. The visitor pressed a hand to the wall. The limestone felt warm, not hot. Warm the way a sunlit rock feels after dusk. A slow, steady warmth that didn't fade when you stepped away. That moment changed the conversation in the valley. This wasn't comfort by chance. This wasn't luck, and it wasn't exaggeration. It was repeatable. From that morning on, the laughter stopped. People didn't admit they were wrong, not yet, but they started watching more closely, counting firewood, measuring temperatures, paying attention to how often smoke rose from the hillside compared to their own chimneys. Winter hadn't finished proving its point, but one thing was already clear. The earth was outperforming the cabin, and there was no arguing with that. Once curiosity replaced doubt, measurement followed. A few men in the valley cared less about pride and more about proof. They brought thermometers, they counted firewood. They watched the shelter over days instead of minutes. What they found made them uncomfortable. The numbers didn't match frontier logic. In a typical cabin, heat came in bursts. The fire flared, the room warmed briefly, then cooled fast once the flames died. Temperature charts looked like saw teeth, sharp rises, steep drops. Comfort depended on constant attention. Inside the limestone shelter, the line was almost flat. The temperature moved slowly within a narrow range, regardless of how cold it got outside. Even after the firebox sat untouched for hours, the room stayed warm enough to work, eat, and sleep without heavy clothing. That wasn't because the fire was stronger. It was because the fire wasn't doing most of the work. The stone was. Limestone has mass. A lot of it, hundreds of thousands of pounds surrounding that single chamber. Once warmed, it acted like a battery. Heat flowed into it slowly and flowed back out just as slowly. Loss was delayed, spread over time instead of happening all at once. Cabins tried to heat air, the shelter heated structure. That difference changed everything. Men began calculating fuel use. Over weeks, then months, the pattern stayed the same. The shelter used a fraction of the wood while maintaining better conditions. Less smoke, less labor, less risk of fire or collapse. Even the airflow made sense under inspection. Fresh air entered low, used air drifted out high, no drafts, no heat stripped away, just steady circulation driven by simple physics. What unsettled people most was that nothing about it was new. No rare materials, no complex mechanisms, no moving parts. The design didn't rely on precision manufacturing or specialized tools. It relied on understanding how heat, air, and earth behave when left alone. Some men admitted quietly that they had known pieces of this already. Miners, masons, anyone who had worked underground. They just never thought to live that way. Instinct had carried the builder this far. Now science was catching up one measurement at a time. And once numbers enter the conversation, opinions stop mattering. The shelter wasn't impressive because it was clever. It was impressive because it was obvious once someone finally took the time to look. Proof doesn't always arrive as numbers. Sometimes it shows up quietly in the way people move when they finally feel safe. One afternoon, a father brought his young daughter to the hillside shelter. She had been coughing through the winter, sleeping cold, waking up tired. The cabin fire kept the main room tolerable, but the bedrooms never held heat long enough through the night. Inside the limestone shelter, she stopped shivering within minutes. Her shoulders dropped, her hands relaxed. Color returned to her face. She asked a simple question that caught everyone off guard. "Is it summer in here?" No calculation could say more than that. The warmth didn't feel sharp or forced. It didn't hit in waves when the fire was fed. It was even, steady, the kind of warmth that lets a body rest instead of brace. The adults noticed it too. Breathing slowed, muscles loosened. No one stood close to the fire because there was no need to. Heat came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere at once. That's when the real comparison began. Cabin life meant planning your sleep around the stove. You woke up to cold. You went to bed wondering how long the fire would last. Children learned early to keep blankets tight and stay still. The shelter changed that. People slept through the night. Fires were fed on a schedule, not out of fear. Woodpiles stopped shrinking so fast. Days felt longer because nights weren't draining. It wasn't just comfort, it was health. Cold weakens people slowly. It tightens joints, it stresses lungs. It wears down the old and the young first. The shelter reduced that strain without medicine, without effort, without constant work. That's why more families came. Not to admire the stonework, not to argue about design. They came to feel it. They pressed hands to the walls. They stood still and listened to the quiet. They noticed how little smoke left the chimney. They noticed how calm everything felt inside. By then, the question was no longer whether the shelter worked. The question was why anyone would choose to suffer through winter the old way once they knew this was possible. Winter hadn't ended, but something else had: doubt. What surprised people most wasn't that the shelter worked. It was that others had known this before. As more visitors came, a few older voices spoke up. Miners, stoneworkers, indigenous elders, people whose lives had taken them underground long before this winter. They recognized the pattern immediately. The earth keeps its own temperature. Stone changes slowly. Depth is insulation. Indigenous communities had carved storage chambers into cliffs for generations, not for comfort but for preservation. Food stayed cool in summer and unfrozen in winter. The rock did the work without fire or effort. In Europe, miners knew the same truth. Deep tunnels stayed calm when storms raged above. You could feel the difference the moment you passed below the frost line. None of this was secret. It was simply ignored. Frontier building had favored speed and familiarity. Logs were easy. Cabins could be raised fast. When settlers arrived exhausted and short on time, that mattered more than efficiency. So knowledge that didn't fit the pace of settlement got left behind. No one questioned it. There wasn't time. The man in the hillside didn't invent anything new. He combined old observations and applied them to a problem everyone accepted as unavoidable. Cold winters, endless firewood, sleepless nights. He asked a different question. What if winter didn't have to be fought? What if shelter worked with the land instead of against it? Once people saw the answer, it felt obvious, almost embarrassing. The stone had been there the whole time. The hills everyone avoided were suddenly valuable. The lesson wasn't about caves or rock walls. It was about attention. Modern tools make it easy to overpower problems. Fire more wood, build thicker walls, add labor. But those solutions come with hidden costs that show up over time. The shelter showed another path. Use mass instead of fuel. Use depth instead of height. Use patience instead of force. That kind of thinking doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't promise quick results. But when winter comes, real winter, it outlasts everything else. What people had dismissed as primitive wasn't backward at all. It was simply older than their habits. And older knowledge tends to be durable for a reason. Change on the frontier rarely announced itself. There were no meetings, no speeches. No one stood up and admitted they'd been wrong. Instead, the hills started to change. People who had once avoided rocky land began walking it slowly. They studied slopes. They paid attention to how snow melted on south-facing stone. They asked different questions at the land office, questions they had never asked before. How deep is the limestone here? Does the rock run solid or fractured? How far before you hit stable stone? Pickaxes followed soon after. Not everyone built a full living chamber. Some carved winter rooms. Others dug food storage spaces that doubled as warm work areas. A few tried small experiments, first cutting shallow shelters into hillsides and watching how they behaved as the cold set in. They learned fast. Depth mattered, orientation mattered, ventilation mattered. The people who copied blindly failed. The people who learned the principles succeeded. What formed wasn't a movement, it was a habit shift. Men shared measurements instead of opinions. Families compared wood piles instead of boasting about fires. Someone would visit a neighbor's shelter, feel the warmth and leave without saying much. A month later, you'd hear the sound of digging on their land. Builders adapted too. Carpenters began working with stone cutters. Timber didn't disappear, but it changed roles. Wood-framed doors, shelves, and summer additions. Stone handled winter. The smartest designs blended both. Above-ground rooms for warm months. Earth-sheltered spaces for cold ones. Fireboxes built into mass instead of freestanding stoves, wasting heat into open air. What mattered most was reliability. Winters didn't feel as desperate anymore. People slept longer. Children missed fewer days to illness. Wood lasted through the season instead of running out before spring. No one called it a revolution, but by the next winter you could stand on the ridge and count the difference. Smoke rose less often. Hillsides showed new scars where stone met daylight. Shelters didn't glow or shout, they simply worked. And on the frontier, that was the highest praise anything could earn. What happened in those hills should have changed everything, but it didn't. Even as the stone shelters proved themselves winter after winter, most builders kept doing what they had always done. Not because the new method failed, but because habits are harder to break than cold. Wood cabins were familiar. You could see them, measure them, build them fast. They fit the rhythm of frontier expansion, where speed mattered more than refinement. When people moved, often long-term efficiency felt like a luxury. Stone demanded patience. It required reading the land, not just clearing it. It required understanding forces you couldn't see: heat movement, air pressure, thermal delay. That kind of thinking didn't come naturally to builders trained to solve problems with more fuel and thicker walls. So the lessons stayed local. Later generations would rediscover the same principles under different names. Engineers would talk about thermal mass. Architects would describe earth-sheltered homes. Scientists would publish charts proving that ground temperature stays stable year-round. They would present these ideas as breakthroughs, but the frontier had already tested them under harsher conditions than any laboratory. It had proven them with frozen fingers, limited tools, and real consequences. The problem wasn't lack of knowledge. It was attention. Modern building often focuses on immediate performance: how fast a room warms up, how cheap materials are, how quickly a structure can be finished. Long-term behavior gets ignored until something breaks. The stone shelters worked because they asked a better question. Not, how do we heat this space right now? But how does this space behave when we stop interfering? That question still matters. Many modern homes burn enormous amounts of energy to correct problems created by their own design. Thin walls, leaky air paths, structures that react violently to temperature swings instead of smoothing them out. The frontier builder in the hillside avoided all of that by stepping back and letting the earth handle what it already knew how to do. That lesson hasn't expired. We just keep relearning it the hard way. Efficiency isn't about technology alone, it's about alignment. When a structure fights its environment, it loses. When it works with it, the environment becomes an asset. That's what the stone shelters taught, and it's what many builders even today still struggle to accept. By the time spring returned, the argument was over. No one needed convincing anymore. Winter had already delivered its verdict, and it did so without emotion. It rewarded what worked and punished what didn't. That was the frontier's only standard. The limestone shelters passed that test. They didn't rely on constant effort. They didn't demand endless fuel. They didn't collapse into discomfort the moment attention drifted. They stayed steady when everything else fluctuated. That steadiness was the real lesson. Most people think survival is about toughness, about pushing harder, about burning more energy when conditions get worse. But the shelters prove something quieter and more useful. Survival is about reducing how much effort you need to survive. Every unnecessary task drains strength. Every wasted resource shortens your margin for error. On the frontier, margins were thin. People didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were exhausted. The limestone didn't get tired. Once heated, it held warmth without complaint. Once carved properly, it didn't shift or sag. It didn't care if a man overslept or missed a fire feeding. It didn't punish mistakes quickly. That forgiveness mattered. Cabins demanded discipline every hour. Miss a step and you paid for it immediately. Stone offered buffer, time, grace. The lesson written in limestone wasn't about caves or geology. It was about how systems behave over time. Structures that smooth out extremes protect the people inside them. Structures that amplify extremes wear people down. The frontier had chosen speed because it had to. But once survival stabilized, endurance mattered more. The shelters represented that shift. They didn't look impressive from the outside. They didn't announce progress. They didn't fit the image of civilization pushing forward. But they solved a problem honestly, using what the land already provided. That's why the lesson lasted. Even after people moved on, even after styles changed, even after the frontier closed. The stone remained. It still held heat. It still ignored weather. It still taught the same thing to anyone willing to pay attention. Real strength isn't loud, it's stable. The mistake people keep making is thinking this story belongs to the past. It doesn't. The conditions have changed, but the principles haven't. Cold still moves the same way. Heat still behaves the same way. The earth still holds temperature better than anything we build on top of it. What's changed is how disconnected most people are from those basics. Today we solve problems by adding systems, bigger heaters, thicker insulation, more fuel, more controls. Each solution depends on the next one working perfectly. When something fails, everything fails fast. The stone shelter worked because it removed points of failure. No pumps, no motors, no moving parts. If the fire went out, the shelter didn't panic. If the weather worsened, the structure didn't care. The system was passive, not reactive. That's the lesson the earth keeps offering. Passive systems outperform active ones over time. The frontier builder didn't need to monitor gauges or adjust valves. He didn't chase comfort hour by hour. He set conditions once and let physics handle the rest. That approach still matters, especially for people who value independence. Anyone who has lived off-grid knows this truth. Complexity creates dependence. Dependence creates vulnerability. Simple systems that work with natural forces reduce both. The limestone shelter wasn't about rejecting progress. It was about choosing the right kind of progress. Progress that reduces labor, progress that increases resilience, progress that works even when you're tired, sick, or distracted. The earth is full of stored solutions: thermal mass, wind patterns, ground temperature, natural drainage. These aren't theories, they're constants. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. It just makes life harder. The people who learned from the stone weren't trying to be clever. They were trying to survive with less effort and fewer risks. That goal hasn't gone out of date. Whether you live on a homestead in a rural house or anywhere winter still bites, the same question applies. Are you fighting your environment? Or are you letting it do some of the work for you? The earth doesn't argue, it doesn't advertise, it just keeps offering the same lesson. Quietly. By the time the snow finally pulled back from the hills, the lesson was settled. No one talked about it much anymore. That's how real change usually lands. Loud arguments fade. Quiet results stay. The stone shelters didn't replace cabins everywhere. They didn't turn the frontier into a landscape of caves. What they did was more important than that. They changed how people thought. They proved that progress isn't always about adding more fuel, more effort, more machinery. Sometimes it's about removing what never needed to be there in the first place. Unnecessary labor, constant vigilance, wasted heat. The man who dug into limestone didn't see himself as an innovator. He never claimed to invent anything. He just paid attention to how the world worked when humans stopped forcing it to behave differently. That's a habit worth keeping. Too often we confuse tradition with truth and convenience with wisdom. We repeat methods because they're familiar, not because they're efficient. We accept discomfort as normal because it's shared, not because it's unavoidable. Winter teaches quickly, the earth teaches slowly. Those who listen to both tend to last longer. The frontier wasn't kind to people who wasted energy. It rewarded those who conserved it. The stone shelters succeeded because they respected that rule. They turned a hostile season into a manageable one without demanding constant sacrifice. That's not nostalgia, that's strategy. Even today, when energy is cheap and systems are complex, the same principle applies. Homes that work with their environment age better. Systems that rely less on intervention fail less often. People who build for stability worry less when conditions change. The earth hasn't changed its behavior. Only our patience has. The limestone still holds heat. The ground still resists extremes. The same physics that worked in the 1880s works now, whether we acknowledge it or not. The frontier builder didn't defeat winter. He stepped aside and let the land do what it had always done. That's the real takeaway. Wisdom doesn't always come from moving forward faster. Sometimes it comes from stopping long enough to notice what's already beneath your feet, solid, patient, and quietly doing the work for you. The earth is still offering that deal. The question is whether we're willing to accept it.